Archetypes in competitive games serve as a means to establish familiarity between the characters and players. They usually adhere to a specific type of playstyle and gameplay experience, which makes them more recognizable and thus easy to pick up. League of Legends, as you know, is divided into many different classes and subclasses, which embody the archetypes that you see in most class-based games, single or multiplayer. You have your beefy frontline tanks, your high firepower marksmen and mages, your team-carrying supports, your elusive and deadly assassins. For anyone who's played games most of their lives, these kinds of archetypes are a common sight, and by constructing your game's mechanics with them in mind, players can smoothly transition from one to another. Classes also exist to form theoretical boundaries for the developers. For example, if you design an assassin, they're usually very fast, nimble, and have high burst damage, but it comes at the cost of low survivability and resilience. With those parameters in mind, you can balance things out accordingly, though historically, Riot doesn't seem to have any problems with crossing the line for a lot of new releases. Now, despite the loose appreciation for class constraints, they ultimately do still fit within the confines of designing a team. Tanks do stuff tanks are supposed to do, mages do stuff mages are supposed to do, supports do stuff supports are supposed to do, and so on. One class that seems to disregard this notion is the fighter class, which doesn't appear to have a specific purpose in a team composition, not in the traditional sense. Of course, the warrior archetype has always been around, but warriors have been synonymous with tanks in genres like MMOs. The Juggernaut subclass in particular has been something I want to elaborate on further for some time now, as it's one of my favorite classes to play, and I think they represent a very delicate balance dynamic for the game. I did brush over them in my class series, but similarly to the video I made on Wardens, Juggernauts are one of the classes I want to go over in greater detail. Conventionally speaking, the role of fighters clashes with the tried and true holy trinity of classes, tank, healer, and DPS. In layman's terms, tanks focus on drawing aggro and soaking up damage for their team, allowing the DPS characters to output as much damage as possible unimpeded. The healer's job is to ensure that the tank doesn't die from that damage to keep the team functional throughout a fight. While this originated in RPGs, any game with a class system exercises this practice to some extent, and League is no different. If you were to take the game's existing categories and section them into the three roles, controllers would be the healer and support, mages, marksmen, and slayers would be the DPS, and tanks would be the, tanks. Specialists are case-by-case basis, as any of the representatives could belong in any of the three. But what about fighters? Are they tanks? Are they DPS? It's unclear as to what they're really supposed to be. Breaking it up into the two subclasses, Divers and Juggernauts, the former comprises primarily high damage dealers like Irelia, Camille, Diana, and such, so one could fit them easily into the DPS category. Most of the time, it's hard to tell the difference between a Diver and a Slayer these days anyway. What about the second group, Juggernauts? They do have a lot of similarities to tanks. They're more than capable of frontlining and drawing attention to themselves. In fact, they excel in that. But they're also not without damage output, sometimes a significant amount. At first, the idea of a tank who can dish out comparable damage to DPS classes seems a bit unfair. The challenges behind DPS is that you're quite vulnerable, thus you need to be acutely aware of your positioning and safety margins. If you step up too far and aggro shifts away from your tank and onto you, there goes your team's entire game plan. By that logic, mages and marksmen are inferior to Juggernauts, right? Depending on how you look at it, that might not be too far from the truth. Countless times we've encountered situations where the enemy Aatrox, Darius, or Nasus bulldozes your backline while browsing Reddit, watching YouTube, and doing their taxes. This type of occurrence has led to half of players arguing if Juggernaut champions are overbuffed, while the other half defends them by saying they need to be at that power level for it to be fair. So who's correct? Are Juggernauts overpowered, or are they useless? To answer that, you have to first understand that class attributes aren't a universal constant, meaning there's more than one way to measure an asset. For example, let's start by looking at DPS as a whole. DPS isn't just a champion's raw power, it also takes into consideration their range, their speed, their uptime, their coverage. You can have one attack that does 1000 damage on a single target and an attack that does 500 damage on up to 3 targets. Both attacks have an average output of 1000, but the latter ranges from 500 to 1500. You can have an attack that does 1000 damage every 10 seconds, or an attack that does 100 damage every 1 second. The average is still 10,000 every 10 seconds, or 100 every 1 second. This holds true for every other combat metric like defense. Defense can be represented by a champion's health, how much damage they can take before they die. It can also come in the form of damage reduction like armor, magic resist, which technically increases your effective health. Or you can consider speed to be a form of defense because if you avoid the attack, you don't take the damage, right? Juggernauts have no shortage of damage output. Mordekaiser, Darius, Aatrox, Alawi, Urgot, they can just as easily obliterate entire teams as mages, skirmishers, and marksmen. They also pack a lot of survivability, making them just as resilient as that of tanks. But what do skirmishers have that Juggernauts don't? Speed. What do mages and marksmen have that Juggernauts don't? Range. These qualities are more abstract in calculation because there's no quantifiable way to measure them against more concrete stats like health or damage. This is how it's possible for Juggernauts to be seen as overpowered on one hand and worthless on another. In a contest of raw individual stat lines in a vacuum, they stand above all else. If you put them in an enclosed space with someone from any other class, the Juggernaut should theoretically always win. And by extension, that should make them the strongest class in the game, right? That would be the case if the environment was designed around mutual exchange, in that both sides are given the same amount of opportunities to attack, defend, what have you. In turn-based games like Pokemon, priority moves aside, whichever Pokemon has a higher speed stat gets to go first, and then the slower Pokemon would retaliate with a move of their own. That's what mutual exchange is in the context of video games. Each participant by default is allowed the same amount of actions irrespective of stats. You could have a speed stat of 0 and still have the same amount of turns as a Pokemon with a speed stat of 999. But of course, League is not a turn-based game. One champion can do multiple attacks in succession before another gets to respond with their own, and that's where the intangible elements come into play. If by chance you were to squeeze a Darius and Jinx into a driving cataclysm and neither can leave the ring until someone dies, Jinx will lose 10 times out of 10 since her combination of DPS and defense are far worse than Darius's. As you know though, Jinx is a ranged champion. Outside of this edge case, most of the time Darius has to spend a lot of turns quote unquote to get within range of Jinx to exert his pressure. Until that point, Jinx essentially gets a bunch of free turns if that makes sense, and by using her various tools like Zap and Flame Choppers, she can extend how many more turns she gets to take without response. Riot is aware that Juggernauts are prone to taking huge beatings just to get within striking distance of their opponents, and subsequently they grant them the luxury of getting more mileage out of single purchases per item to compensate. Juggernauts tend to have very high base damage and parameters for their abilities. As an example, let's compare Darius and Mordekaiser's Qs to Vex and Annie's Qs. When landing the sweet spot, Decimate does 170 base plus 140% of his total AD in physical damage. The base damage might be low, but the AD scaling is incredible. Any amount over 100% is usually bonus AD, but for Darius, it's total AD. Mordekaiser's Obliterate does 294 base plus 60% AP, but it can do 60% bonus damage when striking a single target, increasing it to 470 plus 96% ability power. In contrast, Vex's Mistral Bolt does only 240 base plus 60% ability power, and Annie's Disintegrate only does 220 plus 75%. In a vacuum, Juggernauts have way stronger attacks than DPS classes. They also get a bunch of free stuff like Darius' bonus AD and armor penetration, or Aatrox's battle healing, Garen's bonus armor and magic resist, etc. Thing is, their numbers have to be high because in most situations, Juggernauts go second. Due to their slow mobility and below average range, DPS classes will always be able to strike first, and as you know in a game like League, or hell in most competitive games, first is always better. Why do you think everyone and their mothers play assassins, skirmishers, or ranged champions? You get to go first, and sometimes that's all you need to win. It's kind of interesting to think about. In theory, Juggernauts beat every DPS class in the game since they can do much more per turn than any other class. However, in practice, every DPS class essentially gets a 5-turn head start, which means Juggernauts can lose to every DPS class in the game. A 6-item Aatrox has enough power to destroy a 6-item Zed 3 times over, but if Zed manages to burst in quickly by landing all of its damage, Aatrox doesn't have that time to apply his kit since Deathmark will explode in 2 seconds, taking out the rest of his health. Putting it all together, Juggernauts have fewer turns than DPS classes, but it means they do more with those turns than the other classes, and so, the dynamic between Juggernauts and every other class is to wipe them off the field before they get their turn, so they're balanced by how much punishment they can survive before they get their turn.
My turn.
Therein lies the second point of contention. It's complicated to adequately balance a class designed to go second, some might say unfeasible. Range and speed are amplified in value tenfold in real-time games because there's no countermeasure to balance it out. Going back to the Pokemon example, slow Pokemon also tend to be durable to accommodate the fact that they're moving second. You look at someone like Swampert and compare him to Blaziken or Sceptile, obviously Swampert doesn't look all that fast, but of the three he has the best durability, effectively matching their speed advantage if we go by stats alone. Even then, fast Pokemon are generally prioritized because if you strike first and strike hard enough even with all their defense, they can die before they get their chance. In Fire Emblem games, if a unit has noticeably higher speed than their opponent, they get to attack twice, more or less doubling their offensive power. Slower units, however, tend to have more health and defense, so they'll take less damage from each hit. However, in this game, speed determines your avoidability as well, so players prefer units with high speed and strength since with enough speed, you can dodge most if not all attacks, so there's no need for defense. In real-time competitive games, avoidability and range is in and of itself a defensive stat. You can have staggering amounts of health, attack, and defense, but if you can't hit your opponent, what good are they? No game exemplifies this more than, drumroll please, Smash Bros. For over 20 years, the majority of heavyweight characters have struggled to see competitive viability. They have enough damage and kill power to launch you to the moon in 4 or 5 hits, but with how slow and melee focused they are, characters with range or speed can box them out or run circles around them. Pikachu, Joker, Roy and such can overwhelm Ganondorf, DDD, and K. Rool with their superior frame data, while Cloud, Lucina, and Min Min can prevent them from ever getting within striking distance. The classes in League, for all intents and purposes, resemble the archetypes in Smash Bros. Almost exactly. Juggernauts like Mordekaiser, Garen, Darius, Nasus are very similar to Donkey Kong, Ganondorf, K. Rool, and Bowser. Assassins and skirmishers like Zed, Master Yi, Katarina, and Yone are akin to the fast rushdown characters like Pikachu, Joker, and Sonic. They can blitz down Juggernauts before they get a chance to use their powerful but slow combos. Ranged champions like Vayne, Ahri, and Ezreal share a lot of the same traits as zoners or swordies like Cloud, Min Min, and Samus. Here's the thing, there's an extremely fine line when it comes to balancing Juggernauts that goes second. If you overtune their numbers too much, they'll be able to run down everybody and overwhelm them with their superior stats. If you undertune them, they'll get shredded before they get a chance to do anything. In a head-on mutual exchange, Juggernauts will always win. Therefore, the only two metrics that balance them from mages, slayers, and marksmen are range and speed. If you invalidate those in any way, the latter three will be destroyed. Case in point, Stridebreaker on release. A 300 range dash with an AoE 40% slow that lasted 2 seconds with an effective range of 750. A single item stripped ranged champions of their range and rushdown champions of their speed. Darius, Garen, Urgot, Aatrox, Set, Volibear, these mofos ran a train over everyone during early season 11. Then there was the Gore Drinker Sterix meta in mid-2021. Juggernauts were once again ripping everyone to pieces because no one could kill them. Sterix would give them 1000 HP shield at 2 items, and Gore Drinker would heal them for half of their health. On the flip side, just as how indirect changes or adjustments can catapult Juggernauts into tier 0 status, those same changes can lead to catastrophic results in the other direction. When Stridebreaker lost a dash, many of them lost 2 to 3% total win rate. I remember Darius went from like 54% to below 50, or when Gore Drinker was nerfed, Set dropped from 50% down to 47. 4 years, Riot has been trying to thread the needle to find that sweet spot where those who play Juggernauts feel like they have enough opportunities to take their turns, and those who play against them feel like they have enough time and or resources to make their first, second, and third turns count, because there won't be a 4th, 5th, or 6th. It's a very delicate balance. PvE games like MMOs don't really have this issue because the AI doesn't have the sentience to complain about how unfair classes are. And in turn-based games like Pokemon or Fire Emblem, it's far easier to find that middle ground. For real-time competitive games, it may actually not be possible to find a win-win situation, or at the very least in practice, because it's entirely subjective as to what is the appropriate amount of moves the DPS classes should have before Juggernauts. One person might think it should only be 2 turns, some may say 3 turns. Personal bias has a lot of influence in this debate. Not only that, but we also have to consider that League isn't a 1v1 game, it's a 5v5. ADCs not only have their own turns to impose on the Juggernaut, but their supports as well. Or the Juggernaut might be trying to chase down the ADC and mid laner like a Dr. Mundo running down both the Caitlyn and Talia. Even if we were to collectively agree on, 3 turns, how do we balance Juggernauts in 1v2 scenarios, because then it turns into 6 turns in totality? That is why Juggernauts feel so overpowered in one situation but so useless in another. They're the only DPS class that doesn't strike first. Anyways, I think we're going to end it off here. If you guys have any ideas for how to find that middle ground, feel free to share it in the comments. I actually think right now, at the time of making this video, we're very close to that middle ground. A lot of Juggernauts are sitting very comfortably at like the 49 to 51% win rate mark, which is where you want to be most of the time. Although I still feel like there will be one group of people who think they're OP and another who think they suck. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter, joining my Discord server, and if you still have time, take a look at my videos on stat checkers and fighters, which also cover Juggernauts a bit. For now though, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.